sustainable palm oil industry. We're going to do this through these types of webinars, fireside chats, and other digital communications as we grow this series, and then work towards, once again, meeting in person. Perhaps it will be a physical or a hybrid event for RT21 somewhere in Asia, perhaps somewhere warmer, not like I am right now in New York. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to bring the issues that we should be talking about, not waiting till November, but let's talk about them on a regular cadence on a monthly basis. And while we can't recreate that in-person experience that we would normally get with an RT, we still felt that we could bring some of the amazing content that you expect to see at an RT. And tonight, I think we're going to do that. Tonight, we're going to bring in a global audience, hence the time zone, very early for me here in the Americas, late for you in Asia, and in the sweet spot for Europe. But we're going to bring in that global audience and see if we can't try to bring this content to our membership, which now spans more than 100 countries. In regards to tackling difficult issues and events, we'll be discussing human rights and our grievance systems. And tonight you're going to hear from civil society, NGOs, corporate experts, and representatives of the RSPO like myself. But before we start, I think we have to go through a few housekeeping notes. So if we could start the slides for housekeeping, please. I think the first thing to say, which isn't on this list, is if a pet, loved one, spouse, child happens to walk on screen, it's 2021, we're almost a year into this, and you're probably used to those types of issues. And obviously, if there's any sort of bandwidth issue or technical issue, please bear with us as we all call in remotely from around the globe. Please enter your name, organization into the Zoom using the rename function, just so that we know who's asking questions, what those questions are. All attendees will be muted to enable speakers and panelists to present without interruption. We will carry out this program in English, but we do have simultaneous interpretation. So you can click on the little globe feature and you can pick your selected language. We also invite questions and comments. There's a Q&A box that you should see. Enter your questions in there. And we will do our best to feed them to the moderators today, myself and Alex Expertin from Cargill. We might not be able to get to every question, but we will try our best. We will not take any specific questions on investigations or complaints that are before the RSPO. We also recommend that you close any unnecessary internet browsers, because you never know if you're going to have bandwidth issues. And finally, I think the most important is to enjoy the content. Second housekeeping is, if you can go to the next slide, the RSPO it refers to its antitrust guidelines for the conduct of all of our meetings and conference calls. You can find that on our website here at this link. There should be no specific discussion on selling or buying of materials, pricing, or any joint venture, future or collusive actions, such as excluding or choosing a supplier or geographies. All commentary is limited to current or historical activity. Any discussion or decision you reach from this meeting's material or discussed in the meeting as an individual decision based on your own investigation and judgment. Pretty standard for us when we meet. With that, I sincerely hope you will enjoy this virtual gathering and gain valuable insights from our speakers today. We're going to start by kicking off on our first panel, which is going to be continuing joint efforts to address labor issues. Our moderator for the first panel will be Alexandra Expertin of Cargill. She will be joined by Arti Kapoor of Embode, Matt Friedman of the Mekong Club, Dr. Serena Ishmael from IOI Corporation, and Gerald Joseph of the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia. Alex, the floor is yours.
Dan, thanks for the introduction, and to the panelists and audience for joining this evening and today. There's growing demand for palm oil, and this means a growing need for a large number of workers in plantations. Many palm oil plantation workers unfortunately face a range of social challenges, from an unethical recruitment practices to unsafe working conditions, retention of identification. These workers also often have no access to legal or political recourse. Social issues related to palm oil operations are also among the most difficult to identify and audit. That said, there has been unprecedented collaboration and proactive initiative across the sector, particularly over the past 5 to 6 years. And part of this has been rooted in the RSPO's Human Rights Working Group, which was established in 2014, with the purpose of guiding members in implementing human rights related criteria, identifying areas for improvement that can inform future iterations of the standard, as well as developing mechanisms to identify, prevent, and mitigate and address human rights issues and impacts. Cargill, like other members in the Human Rights Working Group, also bring to bear our experience rolling out initiatives independently or in collaboration with other members, such as our pilot of Ulula, the worker voice tool. It's this diverse experience and expertise around the table that means a really well-balanced group and meaningful collaboration towards solutions. Over the past year, the working group has accomplished a notable feat. We've worked remotely together to develop the RSPO Human Rights Working Group 2023 strategy, which is in fact going to be finalized this week, so you can anticipate to be hearing more about this. Work in the group is over the next 3 years is really going to focus on ensuring women's economic empowerment principles are applied and promoted, alongside improving due diligence, monitoring, and sharing best practices on how to resolve human rights issues, to name a few. So tonight, our panel of experts will share with you insights on human rights trends, opportunities, challenges, as well as progressive initiatives being undertaken by their organizations to tackle human rights issues. So first, we're going to begin with Arti, who will share more insights related to the report commissioned by Cargill, Bunge, Loders, Crocklin, and Mondelez. Arti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. Wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. One of the main reasons you've invited me is because of the report, as you mentioned, that was published by Embode, looking at the situation of migrant workers in Malaysia, with part of the focus on the palm oil sector. And this was quite an interesting and broad study that we conducted. And it did take a couple of years to do it, just because of the access. As you mentioned, it was commissioned by industry, Cargill, Mondelez International, and Bunge Loders Crocklin. And the main impetus for the study was a concern from industry about the situation, but also a kind of need to investigate and inquire into how should industry take up their role and how should industry work with the other stakeholders, government, not just the Malaysian government, but also the sending country governments, the governments of countries where migrant workers are coming from. And there was a real impetus to find solutions about how everybody should work together rather than just regurgitate the facts, which we all know. And we undertook this in 2 phases. The phase 1 was in Malaysia, and we consulted widely across government, non-government, industry, migrant workers, and migrant networks. And the second phase was actually undertaken in Nepal, where we interviewed again the same cross-section of civil society, government, agents at different levels of the recruitment in the labor recruitment supply chain, let's say, from local level, especially where migrant workers are being recruited to go to Malaysia, to the national level. And our findings are laid out, and they're all available on our website, set out the context, not only the regulatory context, but we also did an analysis of how sending country governments and Malaysia's regulations regarding migrant workers matched up or didn't in some ways. And we found some gaps. And at the same time, we looked at the labor supply chain, we looked at the recruitment process of migrant workers, and we did an analysis of how agents work together, how recruitment agents work together, both licensed and unlicensed, formal and informal, local and national, and regional. And we found some really interesting dynamics, economic dynamics, business model dynamics about how workers are recruited. And that's one of the reasons we found that some of the contemporary or current responses to concerns around ethical recruitment or fair recruitment aren't really fitting with the reality of the situation. And interestingly, we also did an analysis of the dynamics, and we made some recommendations to all stakeholders, not just industry, but to governments, both migrant workers sending governments and the Malaysian government. One of our main recommendations was really to make sure we better consult workers. It was one of the elephants in the room, really. We're all talking about migrant workers, but how often do we actually talk to migrant workers themselves? How often are they consulted? Even in public media, we often see articles written about migrant workers' situations, but we hardly ever see, I mean, in the Malaysian context, let's say, but we hardly ever see real consultation of workers. And that's one of our key recommendations. Yeah, and we also did identify some other elephants in the room, but I will leave that for discussion later. I think my 5 minutes is up, isn't it, Alex?
Thanks, Arti, indeed. Serena, you're up next. Serena, you're on mute.
Okay, so thank you, RSPO, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And this is a very important issue that the palm sector has been facing. IOI in particular realized this in 2016, 2017. We decided to work together very closely with Finwatch and as well as with RAND to come up with our recruitment process guidelines with respect to recruiting our workers. And we came out with a labor process, which is the three-part phase. The first phase is pre-employment, in which we looked into the part of recruitment of our workers in different countries like Indonesia, in India, in Bangladesh, and we set out a set of rules to, for example, have a specific checklist for the kind of recruitment agents that we were going to select. We set out a policy of no recruitment fee where IOI, for example, pays for all the fees related to the visas, the levies, the medical, security clearance, and even the transportation from the sending country to Malaysia. We also work towards looking into ensuring that the workers are aware of what kind of job they are doing. We have set up videos for them to be shown at the sending country so that they are aware in their own country what kind of jobs are expected, that they are coming to a oil palm plantation and not somewhere in a hotel or in some nice urban cities. We also set out to make sure that their contracts are being translated in their language to make sure that they know exactly that they are what are the terms and conditions. And this is all videotaped in a YouTube, and you can actually access the YouTube. We also have made sure that at the sending country itself, that we ask them, did you pay for any recruitment fee? So we've set all this part on the pre-employment side. So once they come over to Malaysia, the second phase, which we call the employment phase, is where we sit down and we have a pre-interview at the start when they first arrive to see and ask them a specific questions what is it that they have done, what is it that they have understood, do they know that they are not supposed to pay a recruitment fee? And again, this was repeated when they went to the respective estates and they undergo induction training. So towards the last phase, which is the third phase, which is the end of employment, this is where we have an exit interview to ask them whether there's anything that needs to be addressed in terms of their staying in Malaysia and working in Malaysia before they left for the country. So all this is done under external monitoring as well. We have, of course, RSPO audits, but we also have employed BSR, for example, and most recently last year, we have 2019, ProForest has looked into all our steps to verify that these are being implemented. I think that part of the recruitment process was extremely important, and this was all done by 2018. We have implemented the no recruitment fee and the guidelines, and this was done together with BSR. So I think the next thing that I would like to discuss about is how do we address our workers during this COVID-19? And this is really, really important as well, because-
And Serena, I think that's a great point that we'll come back to in the discussion. So for the, just being conscious of the time, I'd like to move on to Matt, but I will come back to COVID-19 and the impacts on workers. Now, Matt, you're working with companies across textiles, hospitality, and food and ingredients, including the likes of H&M, Mandarin Oriental, and The Body Shop. It would be great to hear your thoughts and in terms of what your organization is doing and some of the trends you're seeing.
So my name is Matt Friedman, CEO of an organization called the Mekong Club. I think to start any discussion like this, we have to focus on the problem. It's estimated there's 40 million people in modern slavery. 25 million of them are in forced labor. 16 million of them are associated with the private sector or supply chains. That means 25,200 people are entering this situation per day, or one every 4 seconds. We, for the last 30 years, have had NGOs, governments, and the United Nations kind of focusing on the issue. But if you look at the statistics, last year, 100,000 people were helped out of modern slavery, which is about 0.2% of the victims, not even 0.5%. Part of the reason for this is the profits generated from modern slavery are $150 billion a year. The amount of money that's used to fight it is about 350 million, or 0.23% of the profits. About 15,000 people like me, do-gooder types that focus on this against 500,000 greed incentivized criminals, and awareness of this issue is abysmally low. So the private sector hasn't really been involved in this until around 2012, where we saw a number of kind of changes taking place. The first was transparency legislation. This was legislation that basically said, if you're a big company and you have products in North America or the UK or Australia or France or other locations, you got to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. There were lawsuits against major companies. We see this in the fishing industry, the chocolate industry, palm oil as well. You see that type of thing. Significant media coverage increasing for the last year. It's doubled every single year. And ESG, the environmental social governance indicator, people are asking questions. How do we know that the products that we're using aren't tainted by modern slavery? So the Mekong Club was set up to basically act as a catalyst for change, working with the private sector in a positive, supportive way to help them identify what the issue was and what to do to address it. So we have an association model. We have about 50 members. The members are divided into 4 groups: banks, manufacturers, retailers, hospitality. We also deal with construction and tech activities. And on a quarterly basis, our association members come together, debate, discuss, and then identify what needs to be done to protect them, to help them, to raise awareness. And so a lot of what we see is training programs that are geared towards helping all different levels of private sector organizations to figure out what they need to do. We develop tech tools that will allow for auditors to go into locations to collect information in multiple languages. We work with blockchain technology. We have developed all kinds of analysis and tools and publications, all of this geared very much to the private sector, so the private sector knows what the issue is, what they need to do in order to address it, in order to move forward. The last thing I'll say is that we try to emphasize a multi-stakeholder approach where we bring the community together as much as possible. This allows for sharing among the members. It allows for them to see kind of and be barometered by peer pressure activities and to basically mentor each other through this process. As a result of us doing this, a large number of people have been identified and helped out of modern slavery, and it's done in a very cost-effective, beneficial way, because you don't have to raise money in order to get them out. Basically, the private sector, once they learn how to address the issue and they have all the tools and means to do it, they do it themselves. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Matt. And I'd like to, at a later point, dig into some of those best practices that have helped support that progress, albeit small. So Gerald, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you to RSPO for the invitation. I'm happy to be here with other panelists speaking on human rights issues. The National Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, in short SUHAKAM, receives complaints of all natures, and one of it is on labor migration issues, either by the NGOs or some individuals. I agree with the speakers about the employment process is totally rotten because we don't have a transparent system or seamless end-to-end system, and also corrupt system does not help make it transparent. So I think that's all where we are at in terms of employment. And then at another layer, the subcontracting. So the supply chain issue comes. The big companies may be clean on the books, but then when you pay somebody else, you need to check at every detail, and that's the tough part. But my worry actually is the smaller players that actually are not don't have the means to ensure that they don't take shortcuts and underpay workers. So we know the reason why this happens by the millions, as mentioned earlier. In this COVID period, it's also the easiest to cut them off when companies are suffering. They don't have the means. They either shut down temporarily. The best thing is pretend that the workers have created some problem, let them loose, and they automatically become unregistered or illegal, as it's called here. You know? So they don't have a fallback system, and many of them do not find it empowered enough to come and make a complaint formally because they are very vulnerable. And we have worked with other human rights commissions in home country, like in Nepal Human Rights Commission, hoping when they actually get back to continue their story, but they don't because they continue with life and seek for money. So we know vulnerability is a big issue. And I think the other point about a specialized issue in Malaysia is about the nature of stateless or undocumented people, mainly in some parts of Malaysia, like in Sabah. That becomes very difficult, and I think the recent forced labor allegations in the US, originating in the US, is pointing to that. And we understand that this is difficult because statelessness and undocumented is not the power of companies to render them these documents. It's the government's duty to resolve. And this state, one part of Malaysia, Sabah, have had this for generations. But these people have families, they have a right to live, they have a right to work, and companies need the employment. They want to legalize them, but without a government policy in enabling such legalization, what do? Do you kick them all out? Do you forget them? And you need them and they need you. So I think it's a strange way to blame forced labor, when actually this forced labor is caused by historical reason, and it's a state responsibility to find a solution for this. But my point is, even if you employ stateless or undocumented person, it's the company's prerogative not to discriminate, because you cannot say because they're undocumented, I'll pay them less, or they don't have weekly leave or annual leave or no medical. So that's my test on companies if they have no choice in Sabah to employ people. But this is a long-standing issue, and that's when I think government's policy framework needs to come in to work with plantation sector, manufacturing sector in order to find some solutions. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop at that point now. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. So RT, I have a question for you. As many in the audience are aware, AP released a series of deeply concerning reports surfacing allegations of forced child labor as well as sexual assault and harassment in plantations. This type of transparency is important for raising awareness of the public. I think we all agree on that. However, companies are finding it difficult to act on this information through their grievance procedures, which have been established in the first place to react and address these issues accordingly. These procedures are really meant to complement more proactive work on progressively improving labor practices in the industry. How do you reconcile the many examples of positive initiatives by the palm industry to improve labor standards with increased reporting and international action against the palm sector for concerns regarding forced labor?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you said at the beginning, Alex, was that this issue is notoriously difficult to audit. And as Gerald mentioned, a lot of these migrant workers are extremely vulnerable and they find it very difficult to speak up. And so in my view and in the work that we've done, we're finding that a lot of the grievance mechanisms, even when they're set up, they're not working. And the reason they're not working is because workers don't feel comfortable to speak up. Worker voice initiatives need to be supported by a culture in companies, in plantations, a culture where workers are able to directly communicate with their employers. In many corporate systems, most of the workers don't feel they're able to directly communicate, number one. Normally, they often communicate through agents. Not in all cases, there's always other companies that don't use agents, such as Dr. Serena has been talking about. And also, workers don't feel comfortable about talking about what they think that they've signed a paper saying, often before they leave their countries of origin, they've signed papers saying they haven't paid recruitment fees. They've signed papers saying they haven't taken a loan, or they're under a lot of debt before they come. They're under huge amounts of pressure. They're also coming from rural parts of their countries. They arrive in Malaysia and it's a new country, it's a new culture, it's a new corporate, and they're extremely vulnerable. So communication and cultural change within plantations is one of the first steps. And this is one of the things that we're not looking at because we're focusing too much on compliance. We're focusing too much on checkbox exercises. But actually, we need some attitudinal, behavioral, and cultural changes in a lot of these companies. So that's one of, I think, the reasons why we've got this disconnect between cases coming up, international reporting by NGOs and the media, and then obviously corporates scratching their head saying, but we're doing everything you're telling us to do, and this is not working. I think that this is one of the areas of disconnect. I could talk more about this, but this is largely how I would describe the problem.
Serena, would you like to respond to that? You're on mute.
So actually, I'm just going to follow up on what RT is saying about workers. I mean, we have workers coming from Indonesia, and I guess with Indonesian workers, because they are more exposed to what's expected in the palm plantation, it's not so much of an issue as when we have migrant workers coming from, say, India or Bangladesh, or even Nepal, because they are not exposed to the palm culture. And I have to agree that to the point in which we have tried very much to ensure that workers, for example, from India, are being exposed to the kind of work that they are going to be given. Even despite that, you're right. It is very difficult for us, to get them to understand. Even when we use people from their own country to translate, at the time of the initial interview when they arrive in Malaysia, and even at the estates when we have what we call the Employee Consultative Council, and each Employee Consultative Council is a representative from their own country to help them to assimilate into the estate. But it's still always an issue. Obviously, they are not exposed to the kind of environment with a different kind of culture, with the kind of language. And this is why, for example, we try to make sure that our workers have their own representation within what we call the Employee Consultative Council, for that they could voice their discomfort or whatever issues. We also have direct, WhatsApp as well, a hotline. But you're right, this is not something that they are, exposed to, and they're not familiar with that kind of reporting. So it's a matter of making sure for us now, especially when we get workers from India or from Bangladesh, to actually now to make sure that they come from villages that are already aware of what their own workers are doing in Malaysia, so that they are comfortable and know and understand what they are facing coming to work in Malaysia.
Serena, thanks. So it's a huge task at hand, and certainly there's room for improvement and reflection here. There's also a role for governments to play. So Gerald, it'd be good to hear from you. Are there any legislative initiatives taking place in Malaysia that we should be aware of in terms of addressing these issues?
Well, Malaysia is stuck in between an elected government and then an unelected government. So it's a very fluid situation. I think that speaks to the lack of political will for the reforms that we thought were moving on. I think just a year ago, 9 laws for labor laws were actually under the microscope, and we were part of it. The commission was part of it to give input for, I would say, quite a progressive rethinking after decades, but it's gone silent now, and that's where I think an opportunity is lost. Number two, just a year and a half ago, an independent committee on migrant labor was considered. I was a member of that committee. Report completed. Our reading was mainly, it's time for a transparent, end-to-end, seamless labor migration policy. So that less hands are involved in between, so less it's cleaner and workers have a say as well as it benefits employers. But that report never saw the light of the day. It's stuck somewhere in the cabinet and it's not made public. So I think it's a waste when 11 independent individuals were called to make a report. So that's the other proposal of reforming the whole migration policy, which is stuck, I think, in 3-4 decades ago. And the power relations are so far, which brings me to my final point about the vulnerability of workers is not only left to people like you and me, either as supporters of rights of human beings or employers or the government of the country they're in. There's also a role and responsibility of the sending government, and this is where the Commission has met many embassies to ask them to be proactively involved. And I think this COVID sort of proves that point even sharper and painfully, because many workers are still stuck in detention centers, although they have cleared their jail time for not having a legal document. They have completed, they should have been sent home. So they are detained not because they have not complied with any law, but because they are stuck in the tangle of the legal, economic, diplomatic. Diplomatic meaning that the government is not able to get a flight, the receiving government has a policy that the flights cannot arrive. The ticket prices have gone up from 500. So many of the employers say, we prepared for 500 ringgit ticket, now it's 1,300. And so all this delaying technique, but all this means that worker is still stuck in a detention center when he or she legally should not be. But because the law is such, they cannot be released out on the open, they need to be deported back to home. So I think the crucial role of the sending government is crucially important. And I think money cannot be a reason not to participate actively. And I think this has been proven even more because usually it's about the bad policies in country, which is agreed. I think all our colleagues here have mentioned it absolutely clearly. And also the cleaning up of the system. And this is where two countries, sending, receiving countries, also have very corrupt practices. So middlemen, middlewomen agencies can put in their hand and try some tricks. And despite all documents signed by workers professing that they have not paid, because they just need that job, So the vulnerability and desperate economic need pushes them here. But how come there is no system that enables them to move from border to border, and that respect is given to them? So I think that's where the reform of laws are there on paper, but I think it's a long way coming. I think it's internal negotiation between companies, between human rights entities, and workers' empowerment. And sadly, the unions here, many of the foreign workers are not unionized, and that makes them even more vulnerable to try to defend their rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. Matt, would you like to weigh in?
Basically, the issue that we face that's most relevant to the palm oil industry is the recruitment process from destination countries. One of the things that we worked on, because our community asked us to do this, was to use blockchain technology to develop an app that would allow for kind of the recruitment agent and the recruitee to blockchain the information, everything that they've gone through, the fees, the pay, everything else, so that when they get to the source country, they are able to, from their phone, access this information. It's not lost, it's not changed, it's immutable. That particular approach offers the possibility of basically allowing the employee to be transparent about what it is that happened, and not to have to kind of say, well, I signed something and now I'm signing something else, because they have access to it. What we anticipate happening over time is that not only will this type of agreement be blockchained, but also within manufacturing sites, agriculture sites, fishing sites, all information related to the employees, the amount of money they get paid, the number of hours they work, and so forth, will be put into a blockchain format. Now, for those of you who don't understand what blockchain is, basically what it does is it takes information and it puts it into a scenario where it can't be changed or altered. And when new information is added, it's added to it, and it creates these things that are called blocks. These blocks allow for transparency, and they offer an opportunity for people basically to be in a scenario whereby whatever information, whatever agreement, whatever thing that they signed is available to who needs it. Let's say a brand is doing an audit or a factory is doing an audit, that information would be available. And so we see this as kind of a trend that hopefully in the future will add value to the transparency issue we see across many countries.
So I'd like to shift over to some of the questions from the audience. We have one from Daryl Delgado. So basis the fact that migrant workers are barred from exercising their freedom of association being a major factor, excuse me, I'm not reading this properly. The fact that migrant and especially irregularly recruited and undocumented workers are systematically barred from exercising their freedom of association is a major factor. While migrants are legally allowed to join unions, they cannot become officers, and existing unions led by locals do not prioritize migrant issues. What are companies doing to address this issue at the recruitment and hiring phase? Serena, could you answer that?
So most of our workers that are undocumented are mostly in Sabah. And in Sabah, the issue of recruitment is not what is occurring in Peninsular Malaysia. So when you talk about freedom of association and union, our workers are all union. They are allowed to join the union, and we are part of the union. So the issue of that doesn't occur in IOI. Now, just going back into the issue of whether or not they are allowed to be, hold an office in the unions, that's not within our control, because that's under the union whatever the local unions are undertaking, that's what they have to address. But in terms of the undocumented workers, we treat them the same as our documented workers, simply because for us, those documented workers, undocumented workers will need to be legalized, and we have to show process of them getting legalized, especially in Sabah, because whenever we are all RSPO certified and under RSPO audit, this is part of what they look at. And we don't only look into the workers, but we also look into the dependents, because the dependents, even though they are not documented, we try to help our our workers to get them documented. For us, a stabilized worker is a worker that will not abscond. So it is of utmost importance for us to get them documented. And the process are all very transparent, because we need to show that we are working towards to get legalized. And and we have been working very closely with the Sabah government to see that they come up with this amnesty program from time to time, so that we can at least try to get our workers, legalized. I hope I've answered part of your questions.
Thanks. Arti, do you have anything to add? Just coming back to your report, some of the good practices that you're seeing in terms of consulting with workers, addressing these issues in plantations, and also, I guess, what companies can do where there is they are working within frameworks which are not necessarily as legal frameworks which are not necessarily as strong.
Just a couple of things also before I directly answer that question. First of all, one of the reasons that, the disconnect that we were talking about earlier between the international reports and what companies are doing, why is there such a big gap? It feels like, migrant workers in palm oil plantations are a lot of them are in remote locations, whereas other foreign workers in Malaysia may be in urban areas working in factories. The particular distinction of plantation workers are that they are removed, and they do feel isolated, especially when they don't have access to, let's say, internet. So that's one thing. And so where do they get access to services? Where do they get access to information about what their rights are, policy changes at the Malaysian level or from their own country level? We know that a lot of the embassies of their countries are setting up Facebook groups and doing lots of kind of announcements. But migrant worker networks, where migrant workers help migrant workers, are unfunded. They cannot be set up in Malaysia. So it's not just that foreign workers can't hold office in trade unions, and therefore their views aren't represented in trade unions, but also they can't associate themselves, and it's all based on volunteer networks. A lot of the efforts that companies are taking is to try and have consultation groups, but that's not working, because at the end of the day, one of the other elephants in the room is what is the way in which foreign workers are considered in not only the Malaysian context, but also in the context of a lot of companies. They're treated as foreign workers, only as foreign workers, not always as human beings that have right to family life. They can get married, they can have children. You cannot bring your family to Malaysia. If you leave that job, you cannot go and work somewhere else. You have to leave the country. So they're only treated in one dimension. And if you imagine your own life to be treated only in one dimension, from your company, from your country, the country that you're living in, it's a very limited situation. So again, coming back to the work that companies are doing, yes, consultation is great, independent consultation. Help your workers have access to independent services, including embassy phone lines, helplines, as well as their trade unions back home. A lot of these workers are members of trade unions back in Indonesia, in Nepal, in India. They have connections in Malaysia to migrant worker networks, embassy consulates. The Indonesian embassy has consulates all over Malaysia, and they have labor attaches, as does the Nepal government, the Filipino government. So these are the kinds of services that workers need to have access to outside of the companies that they're working for. So that's one of the major recommendations I would make, and I think companies can start doing that too. Yeah.
Matt, would you like to respond to that?
This is a question that I don't think I have enough information to respond to. I'll pass on this one.
Okay. So a question to Gerald that's coming up. Thank you for pointing out that it is not about hiring the undocumented workers in Sabah Sarawak. It is about if these workers are treated equally. What is your view regarding compliance to the law and regulations for hiring undocumented workers?
Thanks for the question. So the 2 points. The first is it's a policy decision to address this decades-old problem of undocumented people living in Sabah because of the porous borders historically. So without addressing that, the people live there. It's a lie to say that they don't exist. They have existed. The numbers could be in the millions. They have families, they have children, and they need to live. So I think at one point, if the government recognizes that's a problem, it needs time to resolve it, then create an environment where registration enables them to work on the books legally. The previous government that just lost the last state election, they were moving towards that, but it's a political minefield. So anyone who tries to address that gets attacked and say you are trying to give people free citizenship. This is this anti foreigner logic that don't give people citizenship. And it's not about citizenship, it's about legalizing them and putting them legally on a book so you know who exists. And we've always told the government, you need to know who's in our country. People without documents is not good for economics, for security, for social issues. So get them on the book. You don't have to give them a passport or an IC, but they need to have some documents. So that's the one part. In the meanwhile, I think any company needs to, I think it's about time Malaysia enables company legally that it's okay to hire them. And so then you can check and test the companies that there's no discrimination between undocumented foreign worker or local worker, because I think that standard should be cut across. So my point, it's a long-term issue because law and policy, but regulation can be done. And I think now the system, I'm saying it as I see it and I hear it, is like one eye open, one eye closed, everybody knows they exist and everybody knows that the companies need to employ people to cut the right palm oil and there's not enough workers. So everybody sort of knows this and they smile about it, but what is done? So this increases the vulnerability and does not help respond to other linked up issues. The issue of the women there, the issue of health, the issue of the children's education. That's why I think the working together with embassies for kind of a legal solution. And I think the Indonesian government has set up a few schools. Some NGOs have set up a few schools, which I think is a good way forward, but not enough. It's just a drop in the ocean. If Alex, just move on to add something else on the broader part about
a quick one, Gerald, because we're getting towards the end of the session, but please do go ahead.
Yeah. So actually the few questions asking about the issue of audits, I think RSPO is an expert on that, but I'm going to speak as the National Human Rights Commission. I think it's time, because our investigation powers on human rights violation means we need to go in also to your companies to check on this allegation. It works well both ways because you clear the doubt, but you also can prove the integrity that you have nothing to hide. So unannounced visit is part of our work to move in for prison, police lockups, but I think it's about time. We're talking now with some of the big plantations. After informing them, then we will present ourselves for unannounced visit. And this is, I think someone mentioned that it's not hired by the company. This is on our own account based on information or allegations of human rights violation. Thank you.
On that note, there's a question for Arti. Having looked into labor conditions in Malaysian palm oil industry, do you note a difference between RSPO certified, MSPO certified, or non-certified plantations?
I would need to conduct more research before I could fully answer that. But one of the findings that we did have from our research is that where there is some level of certification, whether it's MSPO or RSPO, there is a greater level of awareness amongst all the different departments of the company or the plantations we're talking about, because they will have to have gone through an internal operational process to get their policies and their conduct in order. So that's one thing. In terms of what I was talking about earlier, compliance versus, changing the dynamics beneath the surface, this is something that is, something else. But generally, I'd say that certification is not the panacea, as we know, but it's always the first step, the second step. And happy to see that, I don't know what the current status is, that the Malaysian government wanted all palm oil plantations to be MSPO certified. That's just the first step, because that puts things in order. Meetings need to be had, this thing needs to be ordered, this policy needs to be had. Then once you've got the system in place, then you work at the next level about how do you actually have a relationship with your migrant workers. It's about having a relationship and actually treating each other in a manner that you listen to each other, mutually respectful. And then you have one of the other things was, companies are doing a lot of training on labor rights awareness amongst their own management staff. And that's one of the good things that we're seeing. Training needs to be also followed up with, attitudinal cultural change in companies. And that's something that's not being talked about enough, because the Malaysian context is such that people have views about foreign workers that infiltrate companies.
So as we come to a close in our session, I'd like to end on a positive note, a hopeful note, and have closing views from the panelists on where your hope, your vision is for the private sector, where you're seeing initiatives that can be scaled. And particularly, Matt, I'd like to start with you, building on a point Gerald made in terms of smaller organizations are lacking capacity. You are working with a number of organizations of different sizes, and so it would be great to start with you in terms of your hope and where you see the potential for working with smaller organizations to improve these practices.
Well, let me begin by saying that I'm super optimistic that enough things are happening simultaneously, both carrots and sticks, that will result in kind of a lot more attention to this particular issue. While we tend to work with large companies, we also find that the smaller companies that want to become larger companies follow what the larger companies are doing. So those organizations that have more resources in order to focus on compliance and risk assessment and audits and so forth tend to be the ones that are identified as doing more. But my personal experience working with the private sector is that we don't go after companies, we go after individuals within companies who for whatever reason care about this particular topic. And so what we try to do is to mine them, and whether they're in a big country, a small kind of big company, small company, medium size, there are always people who for whatever reason really do care about this issue. So we'll do a mass webinar. We will attract attention from all different size companies, and then depending upon the size, we will give them the tools and the means and the insight and the awareness raising and the risk assessment ability to be able to address, even within their organization, no matter what size, what it is they need to do to be on the right side of addressing issues of forced labor. And a lot of the things that we kind of help them with is just raising awareness so that they know what the issue is, and then offering a whole range of different tools that they can use depending upon where they are in their journey in the process to achieve this endpoint.
Thanks, Matt, for those thoughts. Serena, over to you. It'd be great for you to share kind of your hopes for your organization and initiatives that you really think are going to drive that change. You have 1 minute.
Yeah, that's a very short minute. So anyway, I would like to say that, for us, our workers are actually our means to achieve our business. And for us, we think that taking care of them and making sure that they are stable are actually very important for us. So that's one of the reasons why I participate in this sort of series, in sort of panel discussions, to get insights from external stakeholders, so that we can make sure that if there's anything that we can implement within our company to ensure the stable workforce, this is something that we want to look for. So that's about it for the time being.
Thanks, Serena. Over to you, Gerald.
Yes, thank you. I think workers are human beings, so human rights of every worker doesn't fade with any type of status or nationality. So I think that's something to bring forth. And I believe that while we call on, we shout on, we pray, we hope for governments to move faster, reality is a lot of private sector companies have a lot of influence and power. And I think that investment, as I think Dr. Serena also mentioned, in the workers, and the framing of the workers start from their home to present for protection and empowerment. I think without the empowerment part, you lose because they're too vulnerable, somebody will exploit them. And let's hope for greater transparency. I'm inspired that from the worker side, if blockchain works, that's great. From the government side, if Malaysia has a Freedom of Information Act that's long due, like India, there is such an act. And even companies, I think more proactive sharing of your process information will be a great step in the future. Thank you. Thanks,
Gerald. Arti, over to you for your last remark.
Thank you. All right, I'm just going to list the good practices that I've been seeing so far. It's fantastic when companies work with government and try to lift labor standards and other human rights standards within the Malaysian context. We see companies also working with grassroots civil society organizations to help consult their workers. This is also brilliant. Any collaborations with civil society, NGOs, migrant worker networks in particular, working with the workers at recruitment level from the origin countries. We've spoken to workers, they really like that. They really like it when they can speak to their future employers' representatives in the country before they leave. Workers also like direct relationships with their managers. They don't want to have to go through agents. They like to have a direct communication with their managers. They like to be heard. So when they say, look, we don't feel safe in our accommodation and a change happens, they feel like they can trust their employers. Training and awareness for management staff, allowing access to your plantations and your factories from NGOs or other research agencies like us. We were allowed access. These are really good practices. And of course, ongoing research and assessments that, like the one that was commissioned for us, but ongoing work where you collaborate with experts and commission research, because you need to keep on knowing. This is a road of learning, and we can't know it all in one go. So these are good stuff. This is good stuff we've been seeing.
Arti, thanks so much. Some great points today in terms of best practice, improving transparency and raising the voice of workers. I'm looking forward to a continued dialogue with you all through the Human Rights Working Group. And Dan, and thank you to the audience this evening today for your attention. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you all. That was really an amazing panel. That's exactly the type of content that we're going to be looking to bring to this series, where we can really, I wish we had 2 hours for it, but unfortunately we only had an hour. You know, some high level takeaways from my standpoint while we organize our next panel. The consultation with workers is key and has to be key, and we need to continue to improve that. We're going to need unique programs to tackle these issues, and government to government dialogue is needed. We have to get better in that, and I think hopefully the RSPO can play a role in trying to help convene that government to government dialogue. There was a stat thrown out, I think, by Matt, 100,000 or 0.02% of people were helped out of modern slavery. And the private sector just got engaged on this issue in 2012, thanks to transparency efforts. So I think, again, dialogues like this are going to be extremely important in terms of increasing that level of transparency, not just about what's working and patting ourselves on the back, but also talking about what's not working and how do we tackle these issues. there has to be a fallback system for workers when they don't work. That's an important point. So if they lose their job, they're vulnerable, and we have to make sure that there's a system in place for them. The issue of stateless individuals and the historical background on it, I think that's a very important context that we need to explore, and that could probably be a 2-hour session, if not longer, just on that issue. Love the blockchain work that the Mekong Club is doing. And I would love to see us explore that more from an RSPO perspective, and that's just my personal opinion. And I think, you know, it's an important point that the government right now has a chance to address these gaps in the system legislatively, and hopefully we, you know, again, my opinion, we can be a part of that solution if possible. And then I guess overall, one of the biggest takeaways I have is that the worker share of voice has to be improved. We need to look for technology. We need to look for systems that can help with getting that worker share of voice. Wow, that was a great panel. So hopefully in the future, we can continue to bring that type of high level content to this series. And I think it's an amazing segue actually to our next panel. Our next panel is going to be ensuring effective grievance and remedy procedure. Today, we're represented by, we have 3 panelists. We have our RSPO Board of Governor representing the social NGO sector, Dr. Marcus Colchester of Forest Peoples Program. He will also be joined by Datu Henry Barlow, Independent Non-Executive Director of Sime Darby Plantation, and a member of the complaints panel. And we have Melissa Chin of Pro Forest. I think, again, this is going to be an interesting panel, and it's a great segue from what we've just talked about. We heard about grievance systems of companies, and Dr. Colchester has pulled together some slides that he's going to take us through to kind of set the ground rules. Just a reminder, folks, that we are dealing with grievance systems. We can't answer specific questions about specific grievances. So, you know, we won't really touch on that. Dr. Colchester, Marcus, let me turn it over to you to set our ground rules, to take us through the intro and take us through your slides. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to this second session, and thank you for those of you staying up late to listen in to us. Really pleased to have such a great crowd here. Dan's already introduced those of us who are going to speak, but our theme is ensuring effective grievance and remedy procedures. Could I have the next slide? So I will do this short introduction, and then I will give a short summary of the right to remedy in international human rights law and how it fits with our own current procedures and the principles and criteria. And then we'll hear from Melissa Chin, particularly on the supply chain challenge. How do you deal with grievances down the supply chain? And then we'll hear from Dato Henry on his experience with how the complaints panel is functioning, because he is the joint chair of that. And then we'll have a discussion in the same way as we've had with the other group. Next, please. So please respect these norms for the meeting so we can have a good discussion. Apart from the participants in this meeting, we will not name any specific persons, communities, or ongoing complaints or grievances. This is not the right forum for that. The aim is to share our experiences with non-judicial remedy procedures and to learn how we can improve them. So please respect that so we can have a constructive and open discussion. Thank you very much. And then just to guide you, to make questions, please use the question and answer box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and they'll be sent to the moderator, and Dan will take over so that all three of us can be responding to the questions. So thank you very much if you can respect those norms. Okay, next one, please. So I'm just going to present you some framing considerations on what do we mean when we talk about the right to remedy. Next one, please. So actually it's a norm of law that for every harm there is a remedy. That's something people learn when they learn about tort, tort being the French for wrong. And so under international human rights law, it's a norm that violation of a human right gives rise to a right to remedy. And the idea is that that should wipe out all the consequences of that illegal act, that violation, and re-establish the situation which would have existed without the act. If you go through all the human rights laws, you can see this principle of the right to remedy it's everywhere in the law really, and has been there since 1901, but it's also specifically provided for in some of the conventions on workers, on women, on children, on torture, on indigenous peoples, on the African Charter on Peoples and Human Rights, and so on. So it's a very strong principle of international law. Next one, please. And particularly with respect to indigenous peoples, the focus of the work of our organization, the Forest Peoples Programme, the principle that there should be restitution when lands are taken without free, prior and informed consent is very fundamental. Next one, please. So under international law, the main remedies that are talked about can be listed as 5 main principles. The first one is the principle of restitution. And for RSPO, that really means lands taken without consent. That's what we call land grabbing. Such lands should be returned. Rehabilitation, where there's been destruction of watersheds, for example, those harms should be restored so people get their clean water back. If there's been damage, there should be compensation, or somehow that damage is made good. For example, if you can't repair the water system, you provide piped water. There should be satisfaction, so that people feel that their grievance has been acknowledged, and that could take the form of a public apology. And there should be guarantees of non-repetition. So that could be a new law in the case of a state, or a policy in the case of a company, a procedure to ensure that such wrongs do not get perpetrated again. And it's important to understand that in international law, the right to remedy is the general right of all legal persons. So that's individuals and peoples. Next, please. Under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, they have adopted what they call a respect, protect, and remedy framework. And that sets out their whole thinking about how businesses should follow the human rights framework. So whereas states have an obligation to protect and respect human rights and provide remedy for violations and ensure that businesses do too, businesses have a responsibility to respect international human rights and provide remedy for violations. And even this should occur even where national laws don't require the businesses to do this. And the guiding principles have set out special norms for non-judicial remedy procedures, as we can see in the next. Next, please. So these guidelines on non-judicial remedy procedures require that they should be accessible. So we mean shared with rights holders, provided in the appropriate languages. People can be protected from reprisals. They should be predictable. So there should be clear procedures, a timeline, consistent decision-making. They should be equitable. That means there should be a way of leveling the playing field. There should be resources for people to file complaints, and the body should be impartial. It should be transparent so people can see what's going on, both from the complainants and the respondents. So it's all not in a black box. It should be rights compatible. That's to say, it should uphold those human rights. And today we're particularly talking about the right to remedy. And it should be legitimate. That is, it should address the violations and not just try to sweep things under the carpet or just expel members as soon as there's a problem. We want them to help achieve remedy, to achieve a solution to the problems. And in the thinking of the Human Rights Council, they've emphasized subsequently the need to provide mechanisms for learning. So we're monitoring what's going on and we learn from our experiences. You can read more about this in some of our publications noted here. Next, please. So what have we got in the RSPO itself to bring us into alignment with these international norms? Actually, it's pretty good on paper. In our principles and criteria, we specifically require growers and mills to have a dispute resolution mechanism. There must be a mechanism that's mutually agreed for dealing with complaints and grievances coming from the communities. And specifically, that land disputes must be settled through free, prior and informed consent-based negotiated settlements. And that's all set out in the principles and criteria. The grievance procedure is there for smallholders and similarly for workers. And there's protection of complainants, whistleblowers, community spokespersons, what we call human rights defenders. So there should be anonymity, no reprisals, no harassment, access to legal service and so on. Next, please. And a very important part of this, and it's in our P&C, is that must be the choice of how you're represented if you're a collective, through your representative institutions or through your trades unions, as we've been hearing in the last session. So that's a critical part of this. People must feel that they're able to engage collectively to get redress. Next, please. Now, where the disputes escalate from the company at local level to the international level, we have a complaints panel, which Dato Henry will tell us about later. But let's just remind ourselves of what's the purpose of that procedure. It's to deal with complaints, specifically those that arise from the breach of RSPO key documents. So it's not for everything, it's for resolving non-compliance with the RSPO standards. And then it's to ensure that these alleged breaches are resolved in a fair, impartial, and transparent manner. And it's guided by these principles relating to accessibility, efficiency, impartiality, accountability, and independence. Next one, please. So what should we expect from the complaints panel in terms of remedy? And here you can see I've picked out the language. It's quite clear that complainants themselves are asked to state what remedies they are seeking, what corrective actions they hope that the companies will take to respond to their concerns. And then the CP can direct the companies to execute corrective actions within a specified time and so on, assuming, of course, they have found there is a violation as alleged by the complainant. And so then those corrective actions are determined by the complaints panel to remedy the breach that has been identified, including a time frame for implementation of those actions. And very importantly, the respondent should not engage in any form of retaliation, reprisal, violence, threats, or adverse discrimination, so that the complainants don't get attacked for raising issues. The point is to settle the problem, not to cause another one. So just as a final comment from our organization, Forest Peoples Programme, as one that has used the complaints panel, we would say that it is very onerous for communities themselves to use this procedure and is sometimes very slow to reach a result, but sometimes it has been very effective. So in some of those cases, we can say that compensation for damages has been paid. There have been settlements of land disputes through negotiated settlements. Free, prior and informed consent has in some cases been upheld by the panel, and so concession boundaries have been adjusted to exclude those communities who've been saying no to palm for their own reasons. In fact, companies have even been required to hand back land that they have taken without consent. And there have been requirements for guarantees of non-repetition of violations, particularly with respect to criminalization. So we can see that the system can work, although I do think that the panel faces some challenges to really achieve this speedily and effectively, and we can come to that in our panel discussion later. So again, I'd like to thank the other panelists for joining me in this discussion, and we'll now go straight on to Melissa's presentation, who will take us down the supply chain to see what's being done at the other levels of the RSPO. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Marcus. Melissa, you are up.
Thank you. A very good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all. Thanks, Marcus, for the introduction and also for setting the tone of the panel discussion. So in my 7 minutes, I will be speaking generally about grievance mechanisms for companies, especially for those operating in the downstream. Next slide, please. So why is it important for companies to invest in an effective grievance mechanism? Firstly, it provides a formal platform for individuals or groups to raise concerns about the impact a business operation has on them, and also an avenue to seek remedy. It shows openness and willingness to engage with external stakeholders on how the company is performing against its own sustainability commitments. For a grievance mechanism to be effective, companies should be able to respond to stakeholder complaints in a way that is transparent, fair, and solution-oriented. The concerns and problems raised could be at the operational level, but for larger companies, especially those operating in the midstream to downstream, they also operate grievance mechanisms that capture concerns and issues raised in the supply chain. And being able to successfully manage grievances can contribute positively to the overall sustainability of a company's business model. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So there are three general categories of relationships between the grievance and the companies. So in the first instance, you would have the grievance that results from the company's own operations, meaning that the company can take direct action to correct and remedy the situation. And also alluding to Marcus' earlier presentation when he talks about how the UN guiding principles have framed the company's responsibility to respect human rights. I mean, in this particular instance where the company has also contributed to the adverse human right impact, then it's the company's responsibility to seize and prevent and mitigate any further harm, and also to provide for remediation or cooperate in remediation. Then the other instance is when the grievance is resulting from operations of a direct supplier, or as we often call it, tier 1 suppliers, in which case the company has a direct business relationship with the grievance holder and therefore has a direct line of communication to investigate and understand the grievance, as well as to set up the expectations for actions in order to resolve that grievance. And as a last resort, companies also have that power to suspend the supplier for inaction or a lack of action in grievance resolution. And finally, we have the grievance resulting from operations of producers or processes that are further upstream, with whom the company has no direct relationship with. And this is where it gets complicated and challenging to manage, as the company has no direct influence over the grievance holder and has to rely and push for information and action via intermediaries. So in terms of information on the nature of grievance, how the grievance holder is responding to the grievance, and also outcomes of any corrective actions or actions to remedy. So the type of relationship has implications on how the grievance is managed due to the control and the influence or leverage that the company has over the supplier to take corrective action and to provide remedy. And this will shape the type of actions and approaches that the company needs to explore and implement in order to address the grievance. But the UNGPs have made it quite clear that it does not affect the scope of the company's responsibility itself to prevent or mitigate any adverse human rights impact. So this means that the company still has a responsibility to use its leverage to encourage the supplier that has caused or contributed to this impact to prevent or mitigate its recurrence. And this can involve working, with the entity, with the supplier, or other external partners to resolve the issue. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide. I just would like to quickly go through some of the important elements of an effective grievance mechanism. Marcus earlier has already outlined the set of criteria that the UNGPs has established to sort of guide what an effective grievance mechanism should look like. So I'm just basically picking out some key elements that to sort of quickly run through that ProForest has used to work with companies that we support to incorporate and strengthen their own grievance mechanisms. So firstly, it's important for the company to be clear about expectations with the suppliers. I mean, ensure that the suppliers understand the company's responsible sourcing commitments and other sustainability commitments and the expectations to comply with them. So the scope of the grievance mechanism itself should be well communicated to the suppliers so that they are clear on the demand and expectation should a grievance be raised against them. The other thing is a commitment to transparency on the process and outcomes. So all parties know what to expect and what their role is at each stage. And many companies are doing this. I mean, they have established public grievance logs and trackers to this effect. The other thing is to be inclusive, meaning to aim to resolve the grievance in a way which has support from all affected parties through meaningful engagement and dialogue. This also increases trust and confidence in the mechanism, and it also enables the company to understand and respond to the specific interests and concerns of the affected parties. This would enable also better grievance resolution, especially when it comes to the provision of remedy. And finally is to adopt a three-pronged approach to ensure that the grievance is being addressed more comprehensively. So firstly, you have, of course, the concrete corrective actions to address the non-conformity, and which is basically to remove or mitigate further harm or risk of harm to the affected parties. And secondly is to also enable access to remedy to the affected parties for harm caused. So companies need to work with their suppliers to ensure that there is a process for remediation for the harm caused as a part of the grievance resolution. And last but not least, it's to prioritize driving systemic change in production practices and also supplier behavior across the company or group, rather than just focusing on individual cases of bad practice. this, because this will then address the root causes and mitigate the likelihood of recurrence of similar grievance in the supply chain. I think I will stop now and leave the rest for discussion later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Melissa. And so now we'll turn directly to Dato Henry, who will present his experience as joint chair of the complaints panel. And Dato Henry, you're muted.
Is that better?
Now we're good.
Good. Well, first of all, Marcus, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I think there are 3 points which I would like to make in the course of this brief presentation. I don't know whether Dan can put up the slide which covers these 3 points. The first of them is the actual and perceived independence of the complaints panel. It's important and indeed essential that the complete independence of the complaints panel be preserved. This, I believe, can best be achieved by ensuring that the level of CP independence be confirmed as comparable to that of the independent auditor of a quoted company reporting to the board of directors. The CP must have direct access to update the board of governors at all times. Normally, this will be 2 to 4 times a year. For administrative matters only, the CP support team must report to the CEO of the RSPO. The CP procedures have developed a bit like Topsy over several years, so that the standard operating procedures in some cases now are far from the up-to-date operations of the panel. And we look forward to working in the near future to bring these up to date, to reflect the actual proven procedures and reinforcing the principle of complete independence, which I've just outlined. The second item which I would like to raise in connection with the complaints panel is the improved performance of the certifying bodies. One of the most important ways in which the activities of the complaints panel can be facilitated is by ensuring the strengthening and improvement of the certifying bodies system. These are professional organizations which actually certify that production units are compliant with the principles and criteria of the RSPO. There have in some cases been woeful inadequacies in the CB performance in recent years, most particularly in reviewing the labor issues and conditions under which labor operate on the estates and mills. This has not only led to an increase in the number of cases coming before the complaints panel. If the work had been done correctly, the issues would have been picked up long before they got anywhere near the complaints panel. This failure is also related to the recent international objections to the import of Malaysian palm oil products due to alleged failures in labor conditions, which again ought to have been brought up if indeed they are proven. All of this, of course, ties in very neatly with many of the points made by the speakers in the previous webinar earlier on this evening. My third point is the issue of how to handle remediation. I would like to thank you, Marcus, for the details which you've given on remediation and the role of the RSPO in this. The CP is fully supportive of these principles, and in our judgments, we can indeed, and probably should in future, include remediation. We do, however, feel that as a panel, we're not qualified to undertake the detailed remediation procedures, bearing in mind that the panel consists of individuals from a wide range of backgrounds, from banking to NGOs to people with estate experience. We believe, therefore, that this is a role which RSPO can and should take on itself in a way similar to that undertaken until recently by the IMU, which has been monitoring the implementation of decisions of the complaints panel. And I think that this is probably the best way to approach this particular issue. There is a summary of the main points which I feel need to be brought up today. May I hand back over to you, Marcus?
Yes, thank you very much, both of you, for laying out the field of play, as it were. We can see that remedy is a central consideration in our work, but that how to achieve it is problematic, both through the complexity of the supply chain and the various levels of operation of the RSPO in terms of the production itself and then the escalation of complaints. I'd just like to make one additional comment about the operation of the grievance procedures at the field level. We've been getting feedback, isn't this correct, Dan, through our engagement program, that some of the communities are saying they don't find the grievance procedures at their field level very satisfactory. I hope we can get back to that in the question and answer procedure as well. So we'll look at the complaints panel, but let's also not forget to look at that field reality. And then we can also look at the supply chain. So Dan, I think you're going to take us now through the questions and stimulate us into being informative.
Yeah. Well, first I want to remind our audience, and we still have almost 150 people on the line, to send in questions. I will do my best to grab them and read them to our panelists. So please type in your questions, send them our way. We do have some questions prepared already. That's a good point. You know, we have an outreach program designed specifically to work with communities to find out and to understand how we can improve our systems to create that kind of circle of feedback. So it's a very good point that we have to continue those types of programs and make sure that we're using best management practices and constructive criticism to improve our processes. Why don't we kind of actually jump off on there a little bit? You know, Marcus, what needs to be done so that the required grievance mechanism of growers are improved to resolve these emerging problems earlier than later?
Yeah, I think I'm glad to try and answer that. Dr. Henry has emphasized that it's also a problem of failure of audits, not to pick up concerns earlier. And so that's why so much is getting escalated to the complaints panel. But these things should also be addressed early on through these grievance procedures, which are meant to be operational at the company level. And I think we heard some important points in the previous webinar, just the last hour, about how that hasn't been working well for workers either. And it's not just for local communities. But I think what we can say from looking at some of these procedures is that they have not proven to be sufficiently open and accessible to the complainants, and they have not felt protected enough from reprisal in making submissions because of the vulnerability to harassment. And this is particularly the case with gender-based violence, which unfortunately does occur quite often in some areas. And so the risk of violent reprisal against complainant women is something we really have to give greater attention to. So there must be measures to provide for anonymity. Now, of course, I can say that from some of the other companies, we're not naming them today, but they've got these procedures in place. And so that's probably why we're not getting those cases coming up to the complaints panel. It would be a big reason for less complaints being escalated.
Marcus, may I jump in for a moment there?
Certainly, but could I just make one additional point that, as Artie said in the last session, I think it's about retraining staff so that they're incentivized to see that solving problems is good for the business and not something they need to shuffle under the carpet. By all means, Henry.
This business of dealing with labour problems on the estates, and particularly where women are concerned, suggests that in future, CB teams visiting the estates certainly ought to have a female on the team who is competent to address these sort of problems, because I don't see any woman on an estate going up and complaining to a male member of the CB team. And I think we must be urging that this be implemented as soon as possible.
I think that's a really important point, Henry. And I think the question is also, how do we do this? How do we build capacity and encourage more women in Southeast Asia to become auditors? I think, Melissa, maybe you have a comment on that.
Yes, I have a comment on that, but maybe not necessary to the last point you made, but more in general to the points that Marcus
Sure.
and Dr. Henry has made. So in terms of the grievance mechanism at the operational level, I mean, we talked a lot about how the systems are set up, but it's also the people behind the systems. So like Artie mentioned about, retraining to make sure they see the benefits of capturing these problems early. But it's also a retraining or training of being sensitive to be able to process and investigate this kinds of complaints in a way that makes the complainant feel safe. Because in a lot of cases, maybe you have the team at the corporate HQ level that has all these exposure and trainings, but this is to be transcended on the ground to the various operational units that are actually dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. So what ProForest has found also in the assessments that we have done is that sometimes the staff on the ground do not have this kind of sensitivities or soft skills to be able to, to hear out these complaints, even if they were to be brought up. Of course, there are gender committees and setups like that in the estates. But even then, are the gender committee members well trained? Do they know what to do if let's say a female worker were to go and raise the issue with them? Are they able to capture it, in an effective way? And also, the other thing about auditors, I mean, through having female auditors in the team, having female auditors with the right background would be helpful. It's definitely a very good thing to have. I mean, we also in ProForest always try to have this diverse setup when we go on the ground. But at the same time, is auditors, you are there for a short period of time. You don't have the avenue and time to build trust. So even if you have a female auditor, it doesn't mean that the worker will be comfortable to raise this sort of issues. So I also would like to kind of look back to a point that was made in the previous session that I thought was very good, is that, companies can also help to facilitate access to other networks where the workers maybe feel more comfortable, rights organizations, women's organizations. So even if, let's say, the worker will not feel comfortable to channel it to the company, they have other support networks that can help them.
Great. That's really important, and I think this is going to be an important work stream for us. And we have a couple questions coming in, and I'm going to try to paraphrase a little bit. And I think I will open this up to all three of you, but Melissa, maybe just want to build on kind of what you were just talking about. How do we get, and Marcus obviously, and Henry, feel free to weigh in as well, but how do we get the worker to be able to raise the grievance if to the complaints panel or to the secretariat? And we're working on some issues, systems like Alula that Alex mentioned in the last panel. But are there best practices that the RSPO can look to in order, if the grievance system isn't working on the plantation level, that it can come up to the secretariat or to the complaints panel? How do we get that worker share of voice, which we touched on in the last panel? Is there anything that you've seen in your experience that the RSPO could look to?
Well, we have, in our work spoken to NGOs that work on worker issues. I'm taking Malaysia as an example, like Tenaga Nida, the North-South Initiative, Migrant Care, even the union NUPW, and they all have hotlines where the workers can reach them because they trust those organizations. The way RSPO is set up at the moment, it is quite cumbersome, it's quite tedious. So unless you actually have that system where it's very easy for them to access, they can just send you an SMS, a message, without filling like some lengthy forms, reading through some a long page of terms where it's in a language that they're probably not familiar with. And also, I think RSPO doesn't have that relationship with the workers, the way the grassroots organizations do. That's why they feel comfortable to raise those things. But having worker voice tools like Ulula may help. But at the same time, I also kind of like thinking whether is RSPO really that first line of defense that the workers should go to. Yeah.
Great. Henry or Marcus?
I think that we perhaps ought to investigate the possibility of RSPO having some form of a hotline. We'd have to think fairly carefully about this, the way in which it was run. We would obviously have to have the ability within the hotline to answer in 4 or 5 different languages. We're talking about Indonesian / Malay, Bengali, Nepalese, Hindi, and maybe 1 or 2 others, Thai perhaps, and Myanmarese. So it would be a fairly substantial undertaking, which needs to be considered quite a lot more seriously.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. And one of the pilot that we did with Alula, one of the challenges would be, how do you staff and scale up that program? And I think that's something that we're exploring internally as well. Marcus, did you want to weigh in on that? And just, is there a best practice you've seen from maybe the mining industry or another organization to help create that channel between the worker and the secretariat or the governing body?
Well, I think in terms of the best norms, we could really be well served if we're going to do this review of the CAP procedures, as Dr. Henry suggested, if we really do it rigorously against the advice coming from the UN guiding principles on best practice for non-judicial remedy procedures. So we could look at accessibility being one of them, which is what we're talking about now, but all the other criteria that I set out earlier, and just make sure we've really got a system that is as good as possible, drawing from indeed what we can see in some of the other sectors. However, our own reviews of these other sectors, and I put the click there through to our study on my slides, is that they're not doing that well. And the RSPO system is not doing that badly compared to the others, but still it's not doing as well as it could either. So we need to go through these. It is the case that most complaints have to come through NGOs because the procedures are quite cumbersome, quite onerous. There is the language barrier. there is the question of resourcing, and there's the main question is whether there are NGOs in all these areas. I can mention one complaint without talking about a company, where the complaint was about numerous concessions where there was a procedural non-compliance, but we were only able to reach NGOs to help communities in those other areas, in a handful of them, and not the full range of the operations. So we know that the NGO outreach is not strong enough there, which is why we're trying to build that outreach program. So I think there's quite a lot we can do. We are already at the RSPO trialing a hotline for human rights defenders when there are allegations or concerns about violations, harassment, or criminalization of human rights defenders in its wide sense. Then there is a hotline that's manned 24 hours that can be rung, or that they can submit through email and letters and so on. So that we're trying this out, but I think there's a long way to go before we have something good.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we do have the Human Rights Defender line, and that I think we released that in September of 2018. So that is available as a resource, and perhaps, you know, maybe I should look at my team and we should see about how we can work to help companies socialize that more as well. And perhaps it's also using the community outreach program. So Datu Henry, I would like to ask you a question. At times there's basic procedures set out in the CAP that are not followed. Why do you think that is?
Well, as I explained in my earlier presentation, this is because the complaints panel has developed over the last 4 or 5 years, and we have adopted procedures which seem to us as complaints panel to be effective and efficient. We believe that by and large they are effective and efficient. And we have, as it were, outrun the standard operating procedures. And I would certainly hope that once we get down to the revision of the CAP, we will be able to iron out these discrepancies and change the operating procedures as written down so that they match what we have found to be effective and efficient in the implementation of the complaints operation.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, now for those of you on the line that may know me, I was part of the team that helped set up our North American Secretariat in the US. So the downstream is something very close to my heart, sitting here in New York right now. And I want to touch on something that was mentioned earlier about leverage. And so what could we do to help companies get more information on these grievances, but also help them use their leverage as downstream players, where, you know, they have good awareness sometimes of their tier 1 to maybe even tier 3, but how do they get down and have leverage on tier 4? Melissa, maybe you want to take this first, and then we can kind of go around.
I mean, to be fair, it's actually a very complicated issue, and it's an issue that many companies grapple with. And it's like because that influence, you don't have that direct contact and that communication. And that means that leverage has to sort of like cascade down through the supply chain. So you have to work with your tier 1, apply pressure on your tier 1, and the tier 1 has to apply pressure on its tier 1, and so on and so forth. So that becomes quite complicated. And in that sense, and we're seeing some developments here as well. I think, you know, the downstream companies realize that in order to address some of these issues, going through using that leverage is one, but the other thing is also to look at, you know, collaborative approaches, landscape initiatives where they are supplying from, to be able to identify and address these issues early on. So working on projects that address these human rights issues, rather than waiting for it to become a grievance and then having to address it via a grievance procedure. And there are quite a few landscape initiatives that are working with sourcing regions around that. ProForest also is helping to coordinate the palm oil collaboration group, which is made up of like 30 companies sitting in different parts of the supply chain. And this is something that also looking into the various working groups, and one of it is a social issues working group. But I perhaps would let other panelists also comment on this.
Marcus or Henry?
I'm not at all familiar with the downstream issues on these sort of questions. So I think, if I may, I'd pass.
Okay. Marcus?
So I think we need to be prudent about this. We need to distinguish between the responsibility and the liability. And once we have that clear in our mind, that you're not liable for the violations because you're not directly involved, but you have a responsibility not to source from companies that do have that liability, then of course we're greatly assisted by the fact that some of the bigger downstream operators have now fully traced their supply chain, at least right down to mill level. So they know very well which mills are supplying them. And then when they receive information about violations, they have the choice of, do we now try to influence behavior, or do we just have to cut our losses and not take supplies from those mills? Some of the mills are very responsive and some of them are not. And so then they have to make that choice. But I think there is a lot of room for the companies to improve their due diligence, to check the performance of the mills. There's much more information out there than they're presently using, not just coming from NGOs, but there's masses of stuff in the local press, for example, that is not being used. I'd like to to think back on how we improve that key point about the independence and effectiveness of the complaints panel, because I can see we're nearly at the end of our time.
That was literally my next question for you,
okay.
Marcus. How can we improve the complaints panel's capacity, independence, so that we can strengthen it to make sure it's resolving these complaints in a timely manner and effectively?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I strongly support what Dato Henry is saying, that the need for the complaints panel to be independent. It cannot be lent on by members with their own interests, whether they're from the NGO side or from the company side, because then it will lose credibility and we will be in a bad situation. And so it needs to have proper insulation in the way it's structured. So that's something we can review if we're going to undertake this revision of the procedure. I think we should learn from the International Finance Corporation's Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, which has a parallel structure, so that indeed this CAO, as it's called, reports to a very senior level, but it has its own budget, it has its own management system, has its own email system, it has its own offices separate from the IFC, so that it can operate in a very autonomous way, and therefore can be seen to be impartial and not unduly influenced by the IFC staff. We're not as big as the IFC, but we need to have something similar. So I think what that means is the panel should have a discretionary budget to carry out its own operations, and particularly to be able to commission independent investigations with a capable roster of investigators that can be sent to investigate complaints, because it cannot all be done remotely by what we call email ping pong from our NGO experience with the dedicated secretariat that's there. So we'd like to see those elements really strengthened so that the panel can be quicker in the way it deals with complaints. And that's good for everybody. We know the companies themselves would also like something that's been able to act quicker. I do have a question of whether you can really have a volunteer panel taking on such a high task. And I wonder if that's something to reconsider, Dato Henry. At the moment, you are all dedicated and honorable volunteers, and I wonder if that overwhelms your capacity.
Well, we've considered this before, and we feel that if it was to be a paid post, we wouldn't actually get the committed individuals which now sit on the complaints panel. And that degree of commitment is absolutely essential if we're to be perceived to be fully independent. And any failure to maintain that independence, I think, is likely to greatly reduce the commitment of these, my colleagues who assist me on the complaints panel. Touching on the other 2 points that you made, I would certainly welcome a representative from the IFC complaints advisor to sit in perhaps towards the end of our deliberations on the revisions of the SOPs and CAP, just to make sure that we are heading in the right direction and benefiting from their undoubtedly greater experience. On the issue of speed, I think you'll agree that we've speeded up recently. There are still 1 or 2 very painful, long outstanding items going back to, I regret to say, 2010. These are highly intractable, but the more recent complaints that have come in, indeed all these complaints, we are between 2 problems. If we try to resolve the complaint quickly without verifying all the claims and everything that everybody has said, we run the risk of getting the wrong answer. If, however, we are going to get answers from everybody, both sides, on all the points, particularly in the cases of some of the NGOs, it is sometimes extremely difficult to get timely answers from these people. So we have to try and balance the 2. And I can assure you that the complaints panel is extremely conscious of the time that it is taking. And we're looking pretty closely at the average time that it is taking us to resolve the problems.
Great. Well, we are out of time, but I want to, Melissa, is there anything that you wanted to add to that final point before I close our T-series?
No, not really.
All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists, Marcus, Melissa, and Henry, for this discussion. And I want to thank all of the folks that either stayed up late or woke up early or skipped their lunch hour if they did to join us today. I think this is the type of content that we hope to bring to the RT series. We're going to talk about tough issues. They're not going to always be comfortable for the organization, but I think that's the right type of conversation to foster. And you know, just reflecting on this first panel and then this second panel, we got good information on ideas of ways to continue it, to move us forward as an organization. And a core principle of the RSPO is continuous improvement and transparency. And I just want to thank everyone who joined the call today or the webinar. Stay tuned. We'll be putting out more information on our next month's panels. We will be looking at the issue of national initiatives and impact of sustainable palm oil. And we'll aim to make it as timely and as engaging as today's program. So again, thank you to Marcus, Melissa, Henry. Thank you to our previous panel, and good night, good afternoon, and good morning.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
all.
I think that was good, constructive stuff.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you all.